The Reformation had been well underway, starting with Wycliffe and his translation of the Bible into the people's language during the Thyatira church period. Satan saw that one by one the truths he had successfully suppressed or altered during the Dark Ages were being restored primarily during the Church of Sardis time period. The man of sin, son of perdition, little horn, or Antichrist, had been revealed to the reformers. Going back to the Old Testament, we can see that Satan had attacked literal Israel and the earthly temple by leading the children of Israel into idolatry. But in the New Testament, at the cross, a transition occurred that enabled God's message, the gospel plan of salvation through Christ, to continue onward. Spiritual Israel was now entrusted with the message regarding Christ's work in the heavenly sanctuary. Therefore, Satan had to counter with another deception, creating a counterfeit under the disguise of so-called Christianity, ushering in the Dark Ages, a period of persecution lasting 1,260 years, from 538 to 1798. The big question is, how do we know it began in 538? Why? And how did this little horn power come about? But first, we want to see where this time period of 1,260 years is mentioned in Scriptures. Note chapter 3, An Era of Spiritual Darkness, in the book Great Controversy by Ellen White. The prophet John in the book of Revelation saw in vision the very same 1,260-year time period spoken of by Daniel. He described it as 42 months, which equals 1,260 prophetic days. Remember that a day equals a year. Note Numbers 14, verse 34, in Bible prophecy. So 1,260 days equals 1,260 years. And that was from Revelation 11:2 as far as the 42 months. Just as John describes events in Revelation 11:2, Daniel also describes the events of the Gentiles treading down or treading underfoot the holy city of God with these words: He shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand unto a time, times, and dividing of times. Daniel 7:25. Moreover, John saw that God would give power to his two witnesses during this time period, describing this time as 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Revelation 11:3. That's taken from the New King James Version. This time period is identical to the 42 months in verse 2 and the time, times, and half of time of Daniel 7:25. The two witnesses represent the Scriptures, both the Old and the New Testament, of which Christ himself said, These are they which testify of me, John 5:39. Commenting on Revelation 11, the People's New Testament commentary states, It is said that for 1,260 days the witness shall prophesy in sackcloth. Every reader knows that for ages the Bible was forbidden to the people and locked up in the dead languages. It was even a crime for which many suffered death to have the Bible in the tongue of the people. It is proper that we should consider here this period of mourning in which the witness of the Old and New Testament shall be given in sorrow. The People's New Testament commentary on Revelation 11. The Scriptures did indeed do their work under great persecution during the Dark Ages, as the Roman Church sought to keep them out of the hands of the common people, and thus keep the people in spiritual ignorance or darkness. As already stated, this period of 1,260 years started in 538 at the beginning of the Thyatira church time period and ended in 1798. Before we walk through this time of darkness, let's look briefly at the events that began it. The message of Pergamus carried ecclesiastical history to the year 538 AD, at which time the union between civil and ecclesiastical power, which began in the days of Constantine, was consummated. During the time period covered by Pergamus, the Spirit of the Lord was with the church as a church body. But near the end of that period, a separation began to take place. In the years following, there was formed an organization still carrying the name of Christian, and another company separating from that first organization because of the practices of Balaam, the idolatry and fornication practiced by those who were once Christians indeed. Thus, improper education was the cause of the apostasy of the church, and the one sign of its fall was that in its spiritual weakness it sought the civil power for support. By this time, the vast empire of pagan Rome crumbled to pieces, and from its ruins rose that mighty power, the Roman Catholic Church. This church boasted of her infallibility and her hereditary religion. Notice this statement by W.H.C. Friend. Christian Rome was the legitimate successor of pagan Rome. Christ had triumphed, and Rome was ready to extend its sway to the heavens themselves. W.H.C. Friend, The Rise of Christianity, page 773. The Roman Catholic papacy was the fulfillment of the little horn prophecy of Daniel 7. There are at least 11 identifying characteristics in Daniel 7, though we're only interested at this time in the one which enlightens us on the beginning of the 1260 years and the one that leads up to that one. The Roman Catholic Church rose from among the 10 kingdoms into which the Roman Empire was divided. Notice the following verses from Daniel 7. After this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Daniel 7, verses 7 to 8. Of course, this verse goes so well with Revelation 13, verse 1. Let's read that. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy. Revelation 13, verse 1. Next, I would like to share with you a quote regarding this division of the pagan Roman Empire into 10 kingdoms. Even the Romanists themselves admit that the Roman Empire was, by means of the incursions of the northern nations, dismembered into 10 kingdoms. In Machiavelli, with no design of furnishing an illustration of this prophecy, and probably with no recollection of it, has mentioned these names. 1. The Ostrogoths in Moesia. 2. The Visigoths in Pannonia. 3. The Sueves and Alans in Gascogne and Spain. 4. The Vandals in Africa. 5. The Franks in France. 6. The Burgundians in Burgundy. 7. The Heruli and the Turingi in Italy. 8. The Saxons and Anglicans in Britain. 9. The Huns in Hungary. 10. The Lombards at first upon the Danube, afterwards in Italy. And that's from Albert Barnes' Notes on the Book of Daniel, page 322. That fairly well sums up one of the characteristics of Daniel 7:7, the 10 horns. Now let's get back to our timeline as we address the next characteristic. The Roman Catholic papacy did arise to supremacy after the year 476 AD, when the division of pagan Rome, Western Rome, took place. As you can see, this was during the Pergamus Church time period, yet the papal power could not exercise the absolute sovereignty until the 10 kingdoms were subjected to its control. When Odoacer, king of the Heruli, deposed Romulus Agatulus in 476, the fragmentation of the Roman Empire was complete. Yet even though the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire were completed in 476, there were 3 who were rebellious and refused to submit to the Bishop of Rome: the Vandals, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths. These had to be removed in order for the papacy to exercise absolute control, which leads us to the next characteristic, which has to do with the beginning of the 1260 years of darkness. The little horn did uproot 3 of the 10 kingdoms of Western Rome: the Vandals, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths. The story goes like this. 7 of the 10 barbarian kingdoms were converted to Christianity and submitted to the authority of the bishops of Rome. However, 3 of the kingdoms that converted to Christianity embraced heretical teachings of Arius, who was an elder or minister of the Christian church in Alexandria around the year 320 AD, taught that Christ was created out of nothing as the first and greatest of all creatures. Lorraine Boatner Baker's Dictionary of Theology, page 64 to 65. The teachings of Arius were condemned in the 2 great church councils. The first was Nicaea in 325 AD, and the second was Constantinople in 381 AD. These 3 Arian kingdoms were a threat to the supremacy of the bishops of Rome, later called the popes. To make a long story short, these 3 kingdoms eventually were uprooted by the imperial power acting under the influence of the bishops of Rome. The Ostrogoths, originally from Yugoslavia, by order of the emperor, dealt the heretical Heruli a devastating defeat in 493. It happened like this. The Pope requested the emperor to do something about the unorthodox Heruli. In response, the emperor sent Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, to do battle with Odoacer, king of the Heruli. Odoacer was slain, and the Heruli disappeared from history. Then the Vandals were crushed in 534 AD by Belisarius, a general of Emperor Justinian's armies. But there was one remaining horn which needed to be uprooted, and it was the most formidable of all, the Ostrogoths. After the Ostrogoths conquered the Heruli, they became extremely powerful. They were also Arians, so the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, implored Justinian to uproot the Ostrogoths. Justinian, in turn, implored the Franks to help him in his so-called holy enterprise. Note this quote: "When Justinian first mediated the conquest of Italy, he sent ambassadors to the king of the Franks and adjured them by the common ties of alliance and religion to join in the holy enterprise against the Arians." Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 4, Chapter 41, Paragraph 32, page 175, emphasis supplied. There were several battles between Belarus and the Ostrogoths. The decisive battle, however, was in February. Remember the month because we will come back to it later. Of the year 538. The armies of Justinian, as well as the ravages of disease, decimated the armies of the Ostrogoths. They were expelled from Rome and in short order disappeared from the historical scene in Europe. The third horn had been uprooted once and for all. It is of great significance that in 533 AD, Justinian proclaimed a decree in which recognized the Pope's headship over all the churches of East and West. This decree was actually a letter written by Justinian to Pope John. The letter was included in the Code of Justinian, which is a collection of Justinian's laws. It must be remembered that this letter had the force of law. In effect, the Code of Justinian was the standard law of all Europe for over 100 years until it was replaced in the late 1700s by the Code of Napoleon. Part of the Justinian's decree reads as follows: "Therefore we have exerted ourselves to unite all the priests of the East and subject them to the see of your holiness. And hence the questions which have at present arisen, although they are manifest and free from doubt, and according to the doctrine of your apostolic see, are constantly firmly observed and preached by all priests, because you are the head of the Holy Church. For we shall exert ourselves in every way, as has already been stated, to increase the honor and authority of your see." This is from S.P. Scott, The Civil Law, Volume 12, page 11 to 13. The significance of this decree is that the Roman emperor was legitimizing the spiritual authority of the Pope. The state was using its clout to proclaim that only the Pope was the authentic spokesperson for Orthodox Christians. Though this decree was given in 533 AD, it was not fully implemented until the rebel Ostrogoths were devastated in 538 AD. On the devastating defeat of the Ostrogoths in 538 AD, Thomas Hodkins remarks, "Some of them, the retreating Goths, must have suspected the melancholy truth that they had dug one grave deeper and wider than all, the grave of the Gothic monarchy in Italy." Thomas Hopkins, Italy and Her Invaders, Book 5, Chapter 9, last paragraph. Most historians agree that the decimation of the Ostrogoths in Italy marked the beginning of the Middle Ages. Notice the comment by George Finlay. With the conquest of Rome by Belarus, the history of the ancient city may be considered as terminating, and with his defense against Witiges commences the history of the Middle Ages. George Finlay, Greece under the Romans, page 295. It is important to remember also that historians mark 538 AD as it transitioned between Old Imperial or Pagan Rome and the Rome of the Middle Ages or Papal Rome. Notice the words of C.F. Young. It was the last time when Belarus entered in 536 that Imperial Rome, the old Imperial Rome of Italy, as distinguished from the new Imperial Rome by the Bosporus, the Roman created by Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Vespasian, Domitian, Trajan, and a number of others, was to be seen by mankind. Rome, when it was entered by Belarus, was the Rome that mankind had known for centuries. But this Rome was to be seen no more. When 18 years later the Gothic War was ended, a battered ruin was all that remained. Classic Rome had passed away forever, to be succeeded after a time by the squalid and miserable city which is the Rome of the Middle Ages. C.F. Young, East and West through 15 Centuries, Volume 2, page 222. The Ostrogoths did not disappear in 538 AD, but the decisive battle had been won. The handwriting was on the wall, so to speak. In 540 AD, Witiges, king of the Ostrogoths, was dealt a further blow by Belarus at Ravenna. And in 550 AD, what was left of the Ostrogoths was totally wiped out, and the Ostrogoths were swept into the dust heap of history. It is of great significance that today no trace can be found of the Heruli anywhere in Europe. There is no memory of the Vandals in North Africa, and all that remains of the Ostrogoths is King Theodoric's mausoleum, built in the early 16th century in Ravenna. Theodoric was buried in this mausoleum in 526 AD, but today his body is gone. When Belarus conquered Ravenna in 540 AD, Theodoric's body was removed from the casket and discarded. So it is literally true that the three horns were uprooted. As we've previously seen, Justinian gave his famous decree in 533, making the Pope the head of all the holy churches in the East and in the West, and promising to exert his power to increase the honor and authority of the Pope's see. But this official decree of the state could not be fully enforced until the rebel Ostrogoths were uprooted. In February of 538, note the date, the Ostrogoths were dealt a devastating defeat from which, as we've seen, they never recovered. At this point, the state's decree could be fully enforced. It seems more than coincidence that precisely 1,255 years after Justinian's decree, on November 26, 1793, the French government, through its legislative assemblies, proclaimed an official decree abolishing religion and forbidding its free exercise. Churches were closed and Bibles were burned in the public plaza. Concerning this, Sir Walt Scott states, and as the recognition of the supremacy of the Pope seemed thus to be complete, in the year 533, on the part of the Emperor Justinian, who put the power in his hands, so, in like rapid and yet graduated progress, with the same appointed space intervening, the dominion of the papacy was destroyed and disannulled. And in that kingdom, which had been its chief stay for ages, in the year 1793, the power was wholly taken out of the hands of the Pope. And infidelity, or rather atheism, was proclaimed and popery was abolished. The church, or the churches, were in most districts of France closed against priests and worshippers. The bells were broken and cast into cannon, and the whole ecclesiastical establishment destroyed. This is from Sir Walter Scott, Life of Napoleon, Volume 2, page 306, cited in Alexander Keith, Signs of the Times, Volume 2, etc. Remember how, as previously noted, in February of 538, the Ostrogoths were dealt a devastating defeat from which, as we've seen, they never recovered, and at that point, or at this point, the state's decree could be fully enforced, which recognized the Pope's headship over all the churches of East and West. Well, exactly 1,260 years after the Ostrogoths had been uprooted by Emperor Justinian, General Berthier entered Vatican City, removed Pope Pius VI from his throne, and told him that his power was finished. Notably, the date was February 10, 1798. Thus, 538 and 1798 are closely related. Again, in 538, Pope was given universal sovereignty by the implementation of an imperial decree, and in 1798, the Pope was removed from that sovereignty by an official act of the Emperor, by Napoleon Bonaparte. And the power was removed exactly 1,260 years later, to the month after it was given. Surely, this is more than historical coincidence. The little horn was to govern for a period expressed as time, times, and dividing of times, Daniel 7:25. And how should we interpret time? According to the book of Daniel, as we've seen in other lessons, in Daniel 4:28-37, Nebuchadnezzar was given an animalistic mind and ate grass like an ox. For how long? According to Daniel 4:32, this would go on until 7 times shall pass over thee, Nebuchadnezzar. From studying Daniel 4:28-37, one can reasonably conclude that these times were not literal, but symbolic of 7 years. If we now turn to Revelation 12, verse 14, we can read, "And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent." Revelation 12, verse 14. Therefore, we can conclude that this is the same 3.5 years as mentioned in Daniel 7:25. Then applying the day for year principle of prophetic interpretation, notice Numbers 14:34, Ezekiel 4:5-6, we come to 1,260 days or years. This period is also described as 1,260 days in Revelation 11:3 and 12:6, and 42 months in Revelation 11:2 and 13:5. Virtually all Bible scholars agree that in Daniel 7:25, time means 1 year, times is a dual form, which means 2 years, and dividing of time means half a year. But very few commentary scholars believe that the year-day principle must be applied to these time periods. Both preterists and futurists take these periods as 3.5 literal years. Seventh-day Adventists, on the other hand, apply the year for a day principle, and with good reason. The acid test of historical fulfillment requires that the year-day principle be applied to the 12,600 days. In 1986, Malachi Martin, a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest, made the following remarkable statement about the papacy. For 1,500 years and more, Rome had kept as strong a hand as possible in each local community around the wide world. By and large, and admitting some exceptions, that had been the Roman view until 200 years of inactivity had been imposed upon the papacy by the major secular powers of the world. Quoted in Christianity Today, November 21, 1986, page 26. In this remarkable statement, Martin makes 3 very important points. 1, though we would dispute the historical accuracy of the universal dominion of the papacy for 1,500 years, it is significant that Martin does admit that the papacy had a career of over 1,000 years of dominion. 2, for 200 years, the papacy had been inactive. That's 200 years before 1986, which would place us approximately at the French Revolution. This fits perfectly with the statements made in the book The Great Controversy, where the author warns that if secular powers remove their restraint, the papacy will regain its power. And number 3, this inactivity was imposed by the major secular powers of the world. Even David Hunt, a futurist who believes that the little horn represents a literal person who will sit in a rebuilt Jewish temple for 3.5 literal years, admits that the papacy had an apostate career which lasted only 1 millennium. Speaking about the reaction of the church when the Edict of Milan was proclaimed by Constantine, Hunt remarks, "Freedom at last from persecution seemed like a gift from God. Unfortunately, it set the stage for an apostasy that would envelop Christendom for more than a millennium. Christ's bride had been wedded to paganism." David Hunt, A Woman Ride the Beast, page 202 to 203. Again, Hunt writes, "Rome's dominance of church and world for more than 1,000 years through excommunication, torture, and death had led to corruption of such proportions that even the secular world recoiled in shame and horror. The truth is that Roman Catholicism did not represent Christ and was not his church. For at least 1,000 years before the Reformation, the true church was composed of multitudes of simple Christians who were not part of the Roman system." David Hunt, A Woman Rides the Beast, page 190 and 254. It is perplexing indeed that Hunt is not able to see the fulfillment of the little horn in the Roman Catholic papacy. Above, he speaks of more than 1,000 years of papal dominion, of the persecution of the saints, of a faithful church during this period and of a corrupt system which claimed to represent Christ and yet was apostate. Though he apparently doesn't realize it, his description of this period fits perfectly with the description in Revelation 12:6 and verse 13 and 15 as well, and Daniel 7:25. But Hunt fails to see the connection between prophecy and history because he is looking at prophecy through futurist glasses. Hunt's blindness is all the more amazing when we consider his description of what, in his view, the final individual Antichrist will be like. While the Greek prefix anti generally means against or opposed to, it can also mean in the place of or a substitute for. The Antichrist will embody both meanings. He will oppose Christ while pretending to be Christ. When the time has come for his ascension to power, it will be in the midst of an unprecedented global crisis. He will be hailed as the world's savior, and so he will appear to be, instead of a frontal assault against Christianity, the evil one will pervert the church from within by posing as its founder. He will cunningly misrepresent Christ while pretending to be Christ. And by that process of substitution, he will undermine and pervert all that Christ truly is. If the Antichrist will indeed pretend to be the Christ, then his followers must be Christians. The church of that day will, without dissenting voice, hail him as its leader. David Hunt, Global Peace, page 7 to 8, and page 49 and page 200. The fact is, we do not have to wait until the future for Hunt's description of the Antichrist to be fulfilled. Every single characteristic of Antichrist given by Hunt has already been fulfilled in the Roman Catholic papacy. Someone might question if the institution of the papacy arose in the midst of an unprecedented global crisis. Even a curious glance at the history of the Roman Empire will reveal that the papacy arose when the Roman Empire was crumbling to pieces. It appeared that the empire was about to disappear from history, but it did not. It found in the papacy a unifying and saving force which kept the empire together, and the papacy governed exactly 1,260 years. What Hunt and other futurists failed to realize is that, according to Bible prophecy, the papacy was to have two periods of existence. It governed in the past for 3.5 prophetic times, and then was dealt a deadly wound in 1798, but it will also govern in the future when its deadly wound is healed. The only way the future career of the Antichrist can be understood is by discerning its past history. That is to say, only the method of historicism can provide a full and complete understanding of the Antichrist. In contrast to Hunt, the historicist J.A. Wiley did see the papacy as the Antichrist. Notice Wiley's words. It is clear that Antichrist, as depicted by our Lord and by his apostle John, is to wear a mask and to profess one thing and act another. He is to enter the church as Judas entered the garden, professedly to kiss his master, but in reality to betray him. He is to come with words of peace in his mouth, but war in his heart. He is to be a counterfeit Christ. Christ's likeness stamped on base metal. He is to be an imitation of Christ, a close, clever, and astute imitation, which will deceive the world for ages. Those only accepted who taught by the Holy Spirit shall be able to see through the disguise and detect the enemy under the mask of the friend. J. A. Wiley, The Papacy is the Antichrist, page 17 and 18. Wiley shows that the word Antichrist does not mean primarily against Christ, but rather in the place of Christ. Notice how Wiley connects the word Antichrist with the expression vicar of Christ. The Apostle John, speaking of the apostasy, the coming of which he predicts, styles in the Antichrist. And we have also said that the papacy, speaking through its representative and head, calls itself the vicar of Christ. The first, Antichrist, is a Greek word. The second, vicar, is an English word, but the two are in reality one, for both words have the same meaning. Antichrist translated into English is vice Christ, or vicar of Christ, and vicar of Christ, rendered into Greek, is Antichrist or Antichristo. If we can establish this, and the ordinary use of the word by those to whom the Greek was a vernacular is decisive on the point, we shall have no difficulty in showing that this is the meaning of the word Antichrist, even of vice Christ. And if so, then every time the Pope claims to be the vicar of Christ, he pleads at the bar of the world that he is the Antichrist. J. A. Wiley, Papacy is the Antichrist, page 2. While Wiley is not inventing a new meaning for the word Antichrist, it is true that in the Greek, the preposition anti can mean against. But it is equally true that this proposition can mean instead of, in place of, or a substitute for. In classic Greek, for example, the word antibasileus means one occupies the place of the king. One who fills the place of counsel is called anthupatos. In the New Testament, the name Herod Antiochus means that Herod ruled in place of his father. The word antitype means that which takes the place of the type. Christ is spoken of as having given his life a ransom in place of antilutron. In all honesty, we ask how many powers arose after the fragmentation of the old Roman Empire, ruled for 1260 years, and had a leader who claimed to occupy the place of Christ on earth. There is one and only one, the Roman Catholic papacy. One final statement on the 1260 days from the inspired writings of Ellen White. The 42 months are the same as the time, tithes, and dividing of time, 3 years and a half, or 1260 days of Daniel 7, the time during which the papal power was to oppress God's people. This period was stated in preceding chapters, began with the supremacy or the ascendancy to power of the papacy, AD 538, and the termination in 1798. At that time, the Pope was made captive by the French army, and the papal power received its deadly wound, and the prediction was fulfilled. He that leadeth into captivity shall be led into captivity. Great Controversy, page 439. And so we see the starting point and the ending point. We see how this little horn power came into existence, but we still want to cover more on what happened during the 1260, what it did, and the resulting effects it had, and most importantly, what happened at the end of it. We'll begin to get into that in our next study.